Well, it looks like we're finally going to see the sun peek out from behind those clouds, finally, and those temperatures start to rise in this last final week of January. But it's safe to say that up until this point, it has been a brutally cold start to 2025. Just looking at some of the statistics available to us, our climate reporting district here in north central Kansas is showing that we have had a top 10 coldest January on record, and that's dating back all the way to 1892. On top of that, we've had some record snow amounts in some places, certain spots getting upwards of 15 inches within a 24-hour period back on during that storm on the 4th and 5th of January. And some of that snow is still lingering around. Interesting factoid about that is that whenever there's a large amount of snow on the ground, what it does is it creates a feedback loop in the atmosphere. The cold temperature of the surface of the ground that's covered in snow basically reinforces cold temperatures in the air, which can make a cold spell last even longer than the atmosphere would originally dictate just because of that snowpack. And that's something we've definitely experienced here in the north central part of the state for the first month of the year. Things are looking to maybe make a change here in the first week of February, but chances are we're going to head back for another Arctic plunge sometime in mid-month. I'm Luke Byers, and you are listening to Gab in the Cab. Pop quiz. What happens 30 days prior to March 1st? Some of you who are smart might be thinking, oh, January 30th. But those of you who are familiar with Kansas oral lease law already understand that 30 days prior to March 1st, this year, January 30th, is the deadline for which someone who has an oral lease with a tenant on an agricultural lease in Kansas has to give notice of termination if they want that lease to end. Otherwise, any termination notice that happens after 30 days prior to March 1st is invalid, and the tenant has right to occupy that property for the next calendar year. Now, what I'm not doing is urging landowners out there to go and terminate all your leases. Obviously not. But what I would want to do is make you folks aware of what the laws governing oral leases in Kansas are, so that you guys are equipped with the best information that I plan on delivering to you today, so that you can make the best decisions for your properties and your farming operations. The question of whether or not an oral lease between a landowner and a tenant regarding agricultural practices should or should not be continued, or ought to be revisited for some modifications going forward, depends on a lot of different things. But basically, to say the long part in a short way, it all comes down to what both parties consider to be fair. And what is fair? In that case, it is ultimately what both parties agree to. So in some ways, you could say it's a self-defeating argument, because whatever is fair is what you agree to, and whatever you agree to is the definition of fair. But that's the way that oral leases are in Kansas, and it's kind of a challenging predicament to be in, especially if you don't have things written down. So just before I get started on that, I'd just urge everyone out there, if you have an oral lease, at least do some consideration to see if a written lease is right for you. There's an asterisk on that statement to say that, yes, a written lease is right for you. Because even though you might have adequate trust between a tenant and a landlord in an agricultural lease, it never hurts to have anything written down. The only thing that can be hurt by insisting that things be written down between both parties is someone's ego. And you know what? Sometimes it's okay to get that a little hurt, especially when we're dealing with more than two parties involved, especially whenever there brings into questions of determinations on tangential aspects of the lease that may not necessarily be addressed in Kansas oral lease statute. So that's just something to keep in mind as we discuss leasing and lease law and lease rates today, as the title of this episode implies. But I'm now going to say the quiet part out loud, which is the number one question that I receive as an extension agent, specifically an agriculture extension agent, whenever folks call into the office, is about land leasing arrangements. And in a lot of ways, it makes sense, because in many operations, the way that we market grain, for example, is very structured. We have going cash bids, We have futures markets. There's not really a whole lot of controversy or ambiguity in that front. Same way whenever we're pricing our inputs, typically there's a level of negotiation that goes on, but ultimately there's structure to how those arrangements are made between dealers and input suppliers and so forth. But whenever it comes to leasing arrangements, it is, as some of us have referred to it, the Wild West. It's really anyone's game, and navigating it can be a challenging situation. And I would say that factor is probably the main reason why this subject is so commonly referred to whenever we get calls into the extension office. And to broadly encapsulate all of the various questions that we get about leasing arrangements here, it would be a best way to describe it would be to say that people want to know what are the factors that go into constructing a good lease between a landowner and a tenant for agricultural purposes. Now, the majority of the time, the main question in that broader area is what is the quote unquote going rate for a particular piece of property in a particular location? So the question may be, what is the going rate for cash rent in Republic County for dry land crop ground? And I may say something like $90 an acre. But really, that's only just the tip of the iceberg whenever it comes to A, getting good information on questions like those, and B, combining all of the adequate components to constructing a good, fair, and sufficient lease that satisfies the demands and requirements of both the tenant and the landlord in the arrangement. Because I work in a research-based information segment of the economy, it does no one any good if whenever they call in with these questions, if I just simply opine about whatever I think a good going rate or a good lease should be. It behooves me to actually go out into the communities, to the people who farm and ranch in our extension district, and find out uh, what is the actual situation on the ground. What are the main tenets of good uh, landowner tenant relationships? What are the good aspects of an oral or written lease? What is the going rate for dry land or irrigated crop ground or for pasture or whatever the case may be? And so that's one of the major questions that we here at the River Valley Extension District try to address with our biannual Agricultural Land Lease Survey. So, as the name implies, every other year, my colleague Caitlin Nelson and I construct a land leasing survey that we distribute to landowners and tenants throughout the River Valley Extension District to just probe where people are at with the status of their agricultural leases. And with the hopes of getting enough data back from those surveys to kind of get a bead on where the district is at in terms of pricing, in terms of input sharing, in terms of custom farming, in terms of the aspects that identify and characterize each of the leases, things like landowner tenant relationship, landowner proximity to the agricultural tract, and other factors that really help inform us what the condition of the leasing economy or the leasing market really is in the River Valley District, so that we can provide our clients with the best information possible that they can use to put into action on their own farm operations. We had an entire meeting that we had on this just a couple of weeks ago in which we invited members of the community to come out and hear in depth some of the results that we were able to glean from that survey. I won't be able to go into every single detail of the survey's results here today. I'm just going to be focusing on the portions of the survey that pertain to crop leases, the leases that are on cropland, and also on custom farming services and the rates and conditions that we are able to bring back from that segment of the survey. So that's going to be kind of the scope of my discussion today. Feel free to reach out to myself or to my colleague Caitlin Nelson for more information about the particulars of the lease that I won't end up touching on today. And I'll be sure to include both of our contact information at the end of the show. So, dispensing with the blathering introductions at this point, I'm just going to go right ahead and jump into the statistics. So, whenever we sent out the survey this year in 2024, we sent it out to almost 500 landowners and or tenants throughout the River Valley Extension District. This is an increase from the pool of participants that we sought information from in previous years, which was somewhere in that 300 to 320 range. So we increased the amount that we solicited information from other people. And fortunately, and I would like to think as a result of that, we were able to increase the amount of information that we received back from the community. So just to kind of give some summary statistics of how that went, in 2022, so that would have been 2 years ago, our previous biannual lease survey, we received 94 total respondents, people who submitted their surveys back. In 2024, we received 108, an increase of 15%. And for leases particularly pertaining to cropland in 2022, we likewise received 94 respondents. In 2024, we received 95, an increase of 1%. You might be thinking, well, that's not a very significant increase. But one thing that I will mention is that the way that Caitlin and I restructured the lease survey this year accommodated the possibility of people entering information about multiple different kinds of leases, even if they were all both cropland or both pasture or vice versa. So, for example, in previous editions, it would have only asked, what is the most economically important lease on your farm? Please provide information about that lease. Now we are asking information if people have cash leases and share leases, for example, they are able to report on both of those. Likewise, they can report on dry land and irrigated. And so we're basically able to fractionate the levels of granularity to our data to increase the amount of total responses. So back to the summary statistics, we had 95 respondents as in people who responded to these cropland portion of the survey. In terms of responses, that is leases that we were able to analyze as a result of participation in the survey, that was 157, up from 94, an increase of 67%. So now we're getting into the hundreds of leases being analyzed. And when we get into that level, we start to talk about the law of large numbers and statistical significance, and basically getting to a point where we're no longer taking this data and then just using it to take shots in the dark. We're able to take this data and actually formulate some actionable statistics and information based off of it that we can have a relative degree of confidence in. One more caveat before I go on rattling down a long list of numbers is that whenever we talk about the distinction between the 157 leases analyzed versus the 95 respondents, we're not biasing the data to individuals that had multiple leases, because the individual leases that they shared, whether it be a share lease and a cash lease, or a dry land lease or an irrigated lease, do not get combined in their own analyses. They get separated out into their own analyses. Obviously, because you can't necessarily compare a cash lease with a share lease, and you can't compare a dry land lease with an irrigated lease. So we were able to stave off the biases towards particular respondents being overrepresented in the data by only allowing one lease in each of the categories, but by allowing respondents to provide information on multiple categories, we were able to increase the data pool in every category. I'm now going to read off the summary statistics from this year's lease survey data and what the percent change in responses was over 2 years ago. Total respondents, 108, up 15%. Total cropland lease respondents, 95, up 1%. Total cropland lease responses, 157, up 67%. Total cash lease responses, 70, up 75%. Share lease responses, 81, up 80%. Flex lease responses, 6, up 100%. Dry land cash lease responses, 60, up 54%. Irrigated cash lease responses, 10, up 900%. Shared input responses, 45, static at 0%. Custom rate responses, 65, up 8%. And variable rate responses, 7, up 133%. What's the key message behind all of those statistics? What's the main theme that ties them all together? One is that we saw either an increase or remaining the same number of responses in every single category grouping over 2 years ago. The other message behind the summary statistics is that, especially 2 years ago, there were certain categories, particularly irrigated cash lease responses or flex lease responses that had an extremely limited number of responses last year, if we can have, for example, 10 irrigated lease responses this year and be up 900%, which means 2 years ago we had one response. So that's some of the underlying message behind that. The categories that we can have the most confidence in, obviously, are going to be the ones that we have the highest number of data points in. And there is a certain threshold above which we start to have greater confidence in the accuracy of the numbers. And we'll get into that a little bit more whenever I discuss standard deviation. Dry land cash rental rates, probably the number one asked question I get specifically whenever it comes to leasing arrangements, but I'll just run them down real quick for each of the 4 counties in the River Valley Extension District. So Clay County came in on average, remember these are all on average, at $105.64 per acre. That's an increase of 13.95% over $92.71 on average from 2 years ago. Cloud County, $105.20 per acre, up 31.5% from $80 average 2 years ago. Republic County, $99.09, up 7.12% from $92.50 2 years ago. And finally, Washington County, $101.64, up 8.9% from $93.33 2 years ago. Aggregated across the whole district, average came in at $103.46 per acre, up from $91.08 on average per acre 2 years ago. So if we look at that and we look at kind of the percent increases we've seen over the past 2 years, in my judgment, it makes a lot of sense. Up 14%, up 7%, up 9%. We're basically looking at a 3.5% to 6% increase year over year, which falls in line with what we've been seeing, whenever it comes to inflation and also whenever it comes to land values, kind of a composite of those two things interacting. Couple things that I'd like to mention on these particular figures. One, you might have heard that the number for Cloud County increased 31.5% from 2 years ago. So it clocked in at 105.20 this year. 2 years ago was at 80 even. So before anyone gets excited about the increase in rental rates in Cloud County that disproportionately outweighs the increase from the other counties, I would venture to guess that that $80 from 2 years ago was likely a lowball figure, mainly because individual responses from Cloud County 2 years ago were lower than any of the other counties. I believe we only had about half a dozen responses from Cloud County 2 years ago. This year, whenever it comes to dry land cash rental rates, we had double-digit responses from every single county in the district. And so I'm a lot more confident in that 105.20 number this year than I was in that, or am in that $80 figure that we received 2 years ago. So the attenuation likely coming from that $80 figure is probably the reason why we're seeing that 31.5% increase this year. My conclusion is that this is a correction in our data rather than a massive change in the market. One other thing that I would mention is that I've heard a lot of comments from clients and other folks around the community about their suspicions that perhaps cash rental rates would go down in these past 2 years as a result of declining commodity prices. Whenever we conducted the survey 2 years ago, we were at perhaps the height, if not the height, then very close to the heights of the commodity price spikes that we saw as a result of the Russia and Ukraine war that broke out in February of 2022. Because the data that we were collecting then was on leases that were conducted in 2022. I mean, we saw corn in the $6, $7, even $8 range. Wheat was not uncommon to break double digits. Same way with soybeans hitting that $14 to $15 range. And a lot of folks were under the suspicion that this year rental rates would be declining because commodity prices are declining. And there's a point to it. There is a logic to that. The logic behind that says that the landowner is going to receive essentially a proportion of the value of production from the property. But that's not necessarily the case in a cash lease. A cash lease is exactly what it says. It's a cash payment. It doesn't fluctuate necessarily with the yield or production of the property or the price of commodities. if it did, it wouldn't be a cash lease. It would be a share lease or some sort of other lease which has a flexible component to it. Most of the time, whenever we analyze cash rental rates, the economic indicators that they're going to follow are more likely going to be things like land values and the overall trajectory of the economy. Things like inflation metrics, CPI or PPI, that's producer and consumer price indices, so more so than commodity prices. Otherwise, we'd see a lot more volatility in rental rates than we see currently. And that's not necessarily something that's easy to gauge because a lease lasts for an entire year or at least an entire crop year. And so it's really difficult to capture the entire intra-seasonal volatility of a commodity in an entire year-long or a 6-month-long agricultural lease. So that's kind of my explanation on that point. Nevertheless, the data bears it out, regardless of what the theory says, that we did see increases in each of those 4 counties by roughly 7 to 12% over the past 2 years. I'm going to touch on irrigated cash rental rates here for a minute. We don't have a whole lot of data from 2022, mainly because we had a single response. And even in 2024, we didn't get quite enough number of responses for us to be able to say with confidence on a county level basis where things are at. But I do think that we probably do have a relative degree of accuracy whenever it comes to where things are at district wide. So our district average came in at $217 per acre. And then we also had multiple responses from Clay, Cloud, and Republic counties. Clay at 215 on average, Cloud at 183 on average, and Republic at 255 on average. All of that averaging out to $217 an acre, right on line with the 220 that we received as a report from 2 years ago. So a couple of points that I'll make on this information. So just looking at the range of data in the irrigated cash rents, our minimum value for the district was at $150 per acre, and our maximum for the district was $270 an acre. This is a pretty big range if you think about it, but whenever you come down to what range are the majority of leases in, well, the majority of leases are in a $65 range of that $217 value based on the standard deviations we were able to calculate. So if I were to say the average is 217 and I add or subtract $33 from that, that would put us at, say, 185 on the low side and about 250 on the high side. So that's kind of gives us our range. So, and that makes a difference, especially if you have a quarter section, whether it's 185 or 250. But the point of this exercise is to show that the more data we get, the more narrowed in we can get on our data. Let me just go back to the dry land cash rents for a little bit, just to kind of illustrate this point. So the concept that I touched on briefly was this concept of standard deviation. And so what that fancy term in statistics means is basically how far away from average are the majority of data points, or in this case, the majority of leases. And in a normal distribution of leases, we would say that 68% of all leases are within one standard deviation of average. So if average for the district is $103.46, then our standard deviation will tell us how high or low above or below that average is going to be that 68% majority pool. So our standard deviation for dry land is $27.58. So what that means is above 103.46, that $27.58, that gets us to about roughly $130. Below that, that gets us to about $74. So what we're saying is that 68% of dry land cash leases in the River Valley District are between $74 and $130. Now, our total range was bigger than that. But the point that I'm making with all this is if your lease is in that 74 to 130 range, your lease is in the majority. It's in the statistically overwhelming majority, a super majority, you would even argue, at 68% of all leases. A second standard deviation, so we add that standard deviation value of 27.58 again to the outer edges of that range, we get our second standard deviation. And that's where 95% of all of our leases are at. And so that range is $50 to $155. So if your lease is within that $50 to $155 range for dry land, then you are in 95% of all leases in the district. So this doesn't necessarily tell us what the number on your particular lease ought to be. You could be sitting somewhere and saying, well, $85 is fair or $130 is fair. But the point of the exercise is to show that there is a range in which we can have confidence that the vast, overwhelming majority of leases belong in the River Valley District whenever it comes to dry land leases and whenever it comes to irrigated leases. And the width of the standard deviation is going to be dependent on that range and also the number of data points that we have in the set. So the more data we have, the more we're going to be able to shrink that standard deviation and figure out with more confidence where do the majority of these leases lie. Moving on to share leases, the results that we got from the survey were largely in line with what we expected when we rolled out the survey initially. So, looking at the arrangement, the distribution of share arrangements in the district, the overwhelming majority of them for dry land crop ground were in the 60-40 category or in the 2/3, 1/3 category. There were some other outliers there, say 70-30 or 45-55 or 75-25. There was even a 64-36 thrown in there somewhere. But the bottom line is that more often than not, we are seeing either 60-40 crop share leases or 2/3, 1/3 crop share leases. The only times that we had any reports of 50-50 leases were on irrigated leases. And over 70% of irrigated leases were either 50-50 or 60-40. Very few of them had any lower of a landowner's share than 40%. A quick note of analysis on this would be that generally, the higher the per acre gross revenue you get from a crop, the higher the landowner's share is going to be from that crop share lease. And this is because as gross revenue per acre increases, that acre's ability to offset or collateralize a farm's fixed costs increases. And whenever I refer to fixed costs, I mean to costs that don't change with the number of acres that you have. So if you have a lower revenue acre, say, for example, dryland milo, it's often going to require a higher tenant share to help offset fixed costs, higher than perhaps irrigated corn, because irrigated corn is going to have a higher gross revenue. You're going to have more cash flow capacity in order to offset fixed costs more so than you would from dryland milo. Doesn't always mean that irrigated corn is going to be more profitable. It could be that the expenses associated with putting that irrigated corn crop in the ground are higher than that dryland milo. And as such, your break evens may not necessarily line up one crop to another. But the point is that you have a greater cash flow capacity with a higher revenue crop to make sure that the liabilities, the short term liabilities from your fixed costs on your farm, are met by each marginal acre. So that's one of the explanations that I cite whenever I think about why all the 50-50 responses on share leases were on irrigated leases. And as I mentioned before, over 70% of all irrigated lease responses were either 50-50 or 60-40, whereas dryland had no 50-50 responses and were mostly either 60-40 or 2/3, 1/3. Following along the paradigm and the line of thought related to fixed costs and variable costs, when we look at what inputs were shared on share leases, more often than not, the shared inputs were those variable inputs where a varying amount of the input ultimately resulted in a varying amount of production or gross revenue from that acre. So the big four, as I would refer to them, whenever it comes to most commonly shared among share leases, would be fertilizer, herbicide, fungicide, and insecticide. Essentially, nutrients and chemicals. So those are the categories where we see most commonly inputs are shared. Some where there is some sharing, but not always, would include things like seed. We saw that roughly 18 to 20% of the time, landowner and tenant share the input of seed cost. 30% of the time, irrigation maintenance, at least whenever it comes to irrigated leases, 30% of the time that occurs. Whenever it comes to things like terracing, that's only 5% of the time, or structure maintenance, that kind of category. And also things like technician fees or agronomist fees and those kinds of things, consultative services. We saw that about 15% of the time shared between the tenant and the landowner. So whenever it's costs that aren't necessarily directly associated with the production value of the acre, more often than not shared, less often than not shared. It's the big four, or really those two groups of nutrients and chemical applications that end up being shared. Briefly on flex rent. So if we think about two different categories of flex rent, there's a pure flex rent, which is yield times an average cash price times some percentage. We pulled that percentage and it came back between 22.5 to 28%. So this is basically saying what percent of the intrinsic value from the revenue generated from that field belongs or accrues, if I'm using my accounting terms, to the input of the land itself, which is owned by the landowner. And the results came back about 22.5 to 28%, which falls in line with a lot of our net share lease arrangements. Those would be share lease arrangements where the landowner pays none of the inputs but receives a percentage of the gross revenue or of the crop. Whenever we look at cash rent with a flex bonus, these are leases that have a base rent and then have a flexible component. And that flexible component is based on the difference between the actual revenue from production that year and some base level of revenue decided on between the tenant and the landlord times some percent. Again, it flexes only a portion based on what the value is that accrues to the landowner. And that percentage came in a little bit higher, somewhere in the 28 to 33% range. And the base rents that we had reported were kind of a wide range as well. We had base rent as low as $45 an acre and base rent as high as $75 an acre. So using that 45 and that difference between actual revenue and base revenue times that percentage would give the ultimate price of how much you would have to pay. So if it was a low yielding year, for example, then you might have to pay, $70 an acre. If it was a high yielding year, you might have to pay 110. So that's kind of how that flex rent works. Kind of similar to the share concept, but reduces the level of risk on both sides of the equation. Just a couple of anecdotal results from that. Before signing off on here, I want to touch on some other pieces of data that are the subject of major inquiry by a lot of our clients here in the River Valley District, and that is custom farming rates. So there were about 6 different custom farming practices that we were able to gather a sufficient number of data points on to be able to publish with any level of confidence. And those come down to fertilizer applications, usually anhydrous in the examples that people gave, but not all the time. Harvesting, custom planting, custom no-till drilling, grain hauling, and also custom spraying. Fertilizer came in at $20.83 an acre, up 9.6% from 2 years ago, which was 19. Custom harvesting, $36.88 an acre, up from $32.06 2 years ago, an increase of 15%. Planting, $22.04, up 8.6% from $20.30 2 years ago. No-till drilling, $20 even, down 2.7% from $20.57 2 years ago. Green hauling, 18 cents per bushel, dead even with 2 years ago at 18 cents per bushel, and custom spraying at $8.06 per acre, up 9.7% from 2 years ago, which was $7.35. Just a few brief points of discussion on these figures. You'll notice that there's a pattern in the percent changes in custom farming rates as there are for items like dryland cash rent. We're sticking somewhere in that 7 to 12% range. We've got 9.5 for fertilizer, 8.5 for planting, 9.5 for spraying, and 15 for harvest. The only ones where we saw no change or a decrease were in grain hauling, where we were flat, and no-till drilling, where we went down about 2 to 3%. So is that to say that, relatively speaking, no-till drilling has gotten cheaper than conventional planting? I wouldn't venture to say that much, considering especially that no-till drilling had the least number of responses of any of these custom farming practices that we've received data on. But there is a general trend here that does at least gratify the overall speculation about the trajectory of the agricultural economy, that our numbers are relatively accurate whenever it comes to at least the movement of the market in this regard. It's safe to say that 7 to 12% increase in each of these categories is probably expected from over the past 2 years, putting it somewhere in the 3.5 to 6% year over year increase, which lines up again with the trajectory of land values and the trajectory of inflation over the past 2 years. Once again, revisiting the idea of more data points, providing more accurate data. Part of the reason that we're able to have a relative degree of confidence with some of these numbers is the fact that we were able to increase the total number of responses whenever it came to custom farming rates. over previous years. These numbers are also especially important to the agricultural economy because custom farming services are kind of the Wild West. So the point of that saying that there's a great degree of informality whenever it comes to custom farming. And so that's why it's so important that we get a bead on where things are at in the district. And also one of the reasons why people come to us asking questions about custom rates relatively frequently. Not everyone who responded with information about custom rates reported variable rates. And these are additional charges that may be added on a per unit basis to custom farming services when certain unit thresholds are met. Not everyone reported on that, but of the ones that did, we were able to come up with some variable rate estimates based off of those data. So for things like harvesting, we're looking at about 20 cents per bushel in addition to the base custom harvesting rate once a particular threshold was met. In soybeans, it was typically 25 bushels per acre was the threshold. So once you hit 25 bushels an acre, above that, instead of having the flat rate of custom harvesting, it would be an additional 22 cents per bushel. Same with corn harvest, average out about 87.5 bushels per acre threshold. So once corn harvest hits 87.5 bushels per acre, on average, a 20-cent surcharge per bushel above that threshold was added onto the base custom harvesting rate. And for wheat, that 20 cent per bushel on average was added at a 35 bushel per acre yield. One other variable rate that we were able to report was on grain hauling. So if someone was hauling grain from the field to the elevator on a custom basis, on average, there was a 4 cent per bushel per mile premium on top of the base grain hauling rate if the distance to the elevator was above 15 miles. So I've tried my best to condense some of the high points from some of the most asked after content we receive at the Extension Office into this 40-minute podcast episode. I know that there's a lot of data that was included on the survey and included in our data that I didn't really get to dive into to the level of granularity and specificity here in this format, but just want to relay and remind people out there listening that we at the River Valley Extension District are here to answer your questions and meet your needs, partnering with you to address the challenges that face you on your farm operations, in your homes, and in your communities. If you have any questions about the land leasing survey or the results that we were able to gather from them, you can reach out to me directly. My phone number is 785-632-5335, and my email address is lsbyers@ksu.edu. Typically, my home office is here in Clay Center, but I try to make my way around each of the 4 counties on a usual basis. You can also reach out to our livestock agent, Caitlin Nelson, who is located in the Washington office, but likewise covers all 4 counties in the district. You have been listening to Gab in the Cab. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.